There is a question that resurfaces repeatedly in discussions about kink and BDSM. It sounds simple. Can kink or BDSM ever be considered therapy? But the simplicity is misleading. Within that one sentence, we collapse several distinct ideas. What counts as therapy? What counts as therapeutic? What counts as disorder? And what counts as growth? Before answering anything, we need to separate language from reaction. And perhaps we also need to ask, why does the suggestion that pleasure and psychological development might coexist provoke discomfort in some conversations? That is where I want to begin. Therapy versus therapeutic. Why precision matters. When people say kink is not therapy, that is correct. Therapy, in a clinical sense, refers to structured psychological intervention delivered by appropriately trained and regulated professionals. It includes ethical oversight, safeguarding responsibilities, supervision and accountability, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, EMDR, schema therapy. These are all formal treatment modalities. Kink is not that, and nothing in this discussion should be interpreted as clinical advice, diagnosis, or psychological treatment. However, the word therapeutic refers to an effect, not a credential. An experience may be described as therapeutic if it facilitates emotional regulation, reflection, catharsis, increased self-awareness, a felt sense of safety, relief from distress. A long walk can be therapeutic. Music can be therapeutic. A conversation where someone feels deeply understood can be therapeutic. None of those are therapy. So the more precise question becomes, can consensual power exchange activate psychological processes that some individuals experience as regulating, meaningful, or growth-orientated? That is a different and more nuanced inquiry. The nervous system, activation and regulation. To explore that question, we can look at how the nervous system operates. Polyvagal theory, proposed by Stephen Porges and widely referenced in trauma-informed frameworks, though not without academic debate, suggests that the autonomic nervous system shifts between different physiological states. Sympathetic activation, fight or flight, dorsal vagal shutdown, freeze or collapse, ventral vagal regulation, safety and social engagement. Now consider consensual BDSM practice. Scenes often involve deliberate sympathetic activation, heightened arousal, increased heart rate, adrenaline, intensity. But within ethical practice, that activation is not random. It is negotiated. Boundaries are discussed beforehand. Limits are defined. communication structures are established, and many communities describe structured aftercare, intentional post-scene connection and regulation. Importantly, some therapeutic approaches, such as exposure-based models, involve controlled engagement with distress or arousal within a context of safety. That does not make these processes identical to kink, nor interchangeable with therapy, but it highlights that activation and regulation are central to many psychological frameworks. The nervous system does not respond to moral narratives. It responds to safety, containment, and co-regulation. That does not mean kink is therapy. It does mean that physiological regulation may be one mechanism through which some individuals experience it as meaningful. Attachment, trust, and power. Attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth and later researchers, proposes that humans regulate emotion through relationship. Secure relational patterns involve trust that another person can be close without overwhelming, hold distance without abandoning, exercise influence without exploiting. Negotiated power exchange, when consensual and ethically structured, involves trust. It requires the person relinquishing control to believe, I can offer you authority and you will not misuse it. And it requires the person holding power to demonstrate, I can act within agreed boundaries. This is not inherently indicative of trauma, nor is it inherently evidence of psychological health. It is a relational configuration, and relational configurations can vary wildly in meaning depending on context, awareness, and individual history. What the research actually shows. It is important to move beyond theory and examine empirical data. A 2013 study published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine by Vismir and Van Assen compared BDSM practitioners with non-practitioners on several psychological measures. The study reported that BDSM practitioners on average scored lower on neuroticism, lower on rejection sensitivity, higher on subjective well-being, higher on openness to experience. This does not mean BDSM causes psychological well-being, and the study was cross-sectional and correlational. It cannot establish causation. However, it challenges the assumption that consensual BDSM participation is inherently associated with psychological dysfunction. More recent cross-sectional research examining BDSM interests and behaviour has reported higher sensation-seeking traits and greater endorsement of active coping strategies among practitioners compared to control groups. Again, cross-sectional research cannot establish cause and effect, but it complicates narratives of inherent pathology. Additionally, systematic reviews of BDSM research, such as work by Denise and colleagues, consistently highlighted negotiated consent and explicit communication as central themes in both research findings and community practices. These elements, consent negotiation, boundary articulation, structured communication, are not incidental. They are relational skills. Relational skills are not synonymous with therapy, but they are relevant to psychological functioning. The DSM-5 distinction, paraphilia versus disorder. Another important clarification involves diagnostic criteria. The DSM-5 distinguishes between paraphilias and paraphilic disorders. A sexual interest alone does not constitute a disorder. For a paraphilic disorder diagnosis to apply, the interest must cause clinically significant distress or impairment or involve non-consenting individuals. And this distinction matters. Consensual BDSM between informed adults does not automatically meet criteria for pathology simply because it involves pain, power, or intensity. At present, the available research does not support the claim that consensual BDSM between informed adults is inherently disordered. That does not mean harm cannot occur. It means harm is not assumed by default. Trauma, complexity and caution. Trauma and sexuality can intersect in complex ways. Trauma theory suggests that overwhelming experiences may become encoded in physiological and somatic patterns, influencing later relational or behavioral responses. Some clinicians theorize that there is a distinction between compulsive reenactment, unconscious repetition of traumatic dynamics, and conscious, negotiated engagement with agency. However, this area remains complex and highly individual. Kink can intersect with unresolved trauma in harmful ways if practiced without awareness, safety, or consent. But the possibility of misuse does not render the entire domain pathological. Risk exists in many human domains, including therapy itself. The ethical question is not whether risk exists, it is whether the practice is inherently disordered. The evidence does not support that generalization. Cultural narratives and moral framing. Historically, non-normative sexual expressions have often been medicalized before being understood. Homosexuality remained in the DSM until 1973. Female sexual desire has repeatedly been reframed as dysfunction depending on cultural norms. Philosophers such as Michel Foucault have argued that societies regulate sexuality through discourse, through defining which expressions are legitimate and which deviant. When consensual adults deliberately engage in structured intensity, ritualized power, and negotiated vulnerability, it challenges normative assumptions. For some observers, that challenge produces discomfort. But discomfort is not evidence of disorder. The ethical boundary. It is essential to be clear. Kink should not be presented as a substitute for licensed psychological treatment. It should never be marketed as a cure for trauma, depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions. Overclaiming is ethically dangerous. At the same time, dismissing all potential psychological significance within consensual power exchange may oversimplify a complex human behavior. Human beings regulate through relationship, through ritual, through embodied experience, through negotiated vulnerability. If an experience facilitates emotional regulation, relational trust, or self-understanding, an individual may describe it as therapeutic in effect. That does not make it therapy. Precision matters. Reframing the question. Perhaps the more useful question is not, can kink be therapy? But, what psychological processes are activated within consensual power exchange? And how do we evaluate those processes responsibly? Complex conversations require tolerance for nuance. Two statements can be true simultaneously. Kink is not clinical treatment, and kink can intersect with meaningful psychological processes for some individuals. Both can exist without contradiction. Closing. Conversations about sexuality deserve intellectual care. They deserve empirical grounding, and they deserve restraint. And the burden of proof lies with claims of pathology, and at present, the evidence does not support the assertion that consensual BDSM between informed adults is inherently disordered. What it reveals instead is variation, diversity, intensity, human complexity, not therapy, but not inherently dysfunction either, and perhaps the space between those extremes is where mature conversation begins. They deserve empirical grounding, and they deserve restraint. And the burden of proof lies with claims of pathology, and at present, the evidence does not support the assertion that consensual BDSM between informed adults is inherently disordered. What it reveals instead is variation, diversity, intensity, human complexity, not therapy, but not inherently dysfunction either, and perhaps the space between those extremes is where mature conversation begins.